Priors. I'm your host, Dr. Alice Evans, and with me today is Professor Augustina Paglayan. Welcome.
Hi, Alice. Great to be here.
Hi. So now we're going to discuss your phenomenal new book, Raised to Obey. Tell me all about this.
Oh my gosh. Where do I start? The book. I'll tell you a little bit about how this idea for the book started, which was had nothing to do with looking at history. I wasn't interested in looking at history per se. I was interested in understanding a contemporary problem, which is this disconnect that exists around the world between the level of schooling that countries have and the level of skills that kids in school have. So there's been great progress in terms of access to education, but really lackluster performance on skills, even basic literacy and numeracy, and of course, even more advanced things like critical thinking. And so, when I worked at the World Bank, there was a lot of conversation around this so-called learning crisis. That's the way people at the World Bank refer to it, and in international development spheres. And the underlying explanation that people had and continue to have about the roots of this learning crisis was that the problem was that policymakers don't know what are the right policies to promote learning. And so that what needed to be done to solve this problem of learning was to invest a lot in studies, RCTs, other experimental research designs, etc., to figure out what education policies promote learning and then disseminate that knowledge among policymakers, and that would promote improvement. And I grew up in a country where it was very clear to anyone who paid attention that politics actually couldn't be ignored if you wanted to understand why countries fail to adopt policies that promote growth, that support human capital, and so on and so forth. And so I was always really curious about the way in which politics had shaped the trajectory of education systems. As I started investigating the the ways in which politicians make decisions about education, naturally I kept going further and further back in time to the foundational period, the period when education systems were created and set. That it's the period when the many of the education institutions we have to this day were created, and looking at the debates that politicians had around that foundational period, what I discovered was that their goal was not to promote skills. Their primary goal was to use primary education as a means to instill obedience to the state and to its laws in order to promote social order, promote political stability, and ensure the sustainability of the status quo. And so it it gave me a very different perspective about the problem of low learning that we have today, right? It's not just about lack of knowledge on what works to promote learning. There's also a very deep root that has to do with the fact that these systems were not designed or created with the goal of promoting learning, and we've inherited in many ways those institutions from back in the
Okay.
day that were designed
So
to
this is
indoctrinate.
awesome. I'm going to stop you there. Okay. So basically, you're saying everyone in the education, well, a lot of people in the education sector are like, okay, let's find the best evidence, let's see what worked, and we'll give that to the politicians. And then because they want the best for their children, they roll it out. And you're saying, wait a minute, maybe they've got different motivations.
Exactly.
Okay. So, what I want to do in this podcast is to start off by getting really nerdy and going through all your quantitative methodology and also your qualitative historical case studies because they're awesome. I want to examine all the different hypotheses because you're super rigorous. Then I want to try to explain all those differences between countries, why some liberalized, why some haven't. And then we'll wrap it all up with the contemporary implications. So, first of all, let me just start. What is your dependent variable? When you look historically, what are you trying to explain?
There are several things that I want to explain. One is, when were public primary education systems created? So, when was the government or the state interested in taking over control over the regulation of primary schools? So, regulating the curriculum, regulating who can become a teacher, etc. So, creation of laws. The second thing I'm also interested in is the expansion of access to primary education, because you can pass laws and then do nothing. So I'm also interested in actual expansion of enrollment and access to primary education. And then the third thing that I'm also interested is the content of these foundational laws. So, what is the content of the curriculum according to these laws? How should teachers be trained and recruited? Are there compulsory schooling provisions, and what are those? How are schools supposed to be inspected? So, these are also part of the set of things that I'm trying to explain and understand.
Awesome. Okay. So now you consider all the different possible motivations. Was it nation building? Was it industrialization? Was it democratization? Can you talk me through the quantitative work you do in trying to unpick those different possible explanations?
Yes, absolutely. So, uh, one of the basic things that I do, so going back to the dependent variables, right? One of the dependent variables, as I said, is the laws. And when are these foundational education laws passed? So, for example, in Prussia, it's the law of 1763. In Argentina, it's the law of 1884. In Norway, 1814. And so different countries have different national primary education laws. And the first thing I do is compare the timing of these laws with the timing of these supposed explanations that are very common. So, for example, how does the timing of these laws compare to the timing of the spread of democracy? Was the expansion of the franchise to all males something that preceded or something that came after the laws? And so that's one thing that I do for the various explanations. I do the same for industrialization. Did these laws get passed before or after the onset of the first and the second industrial revolution in each country? The second thing that I do for these various theories is also look at enrollment. So, um, does access to primary education as measured by enrollment accelerate? The expansion gets faster after men are given the right to vote, after the onset of industrialization, after a war between states that might create kind of more interest in nation building, and so on and so forth. So that's the other thing I do. And then the last thing, as I said, was to look at the content of the laws and see, okay, does the content of this law and what that tells me about the goals of education, is that consistent with what this theory said was the goal of education? That's the final part.
Okay, so if we do that timing analysis, what does that timing analysis tell us about the contending theories like democratization, industrialization?
That for the Western world, those theories are very limited. They don't really go far in explaining why the Western world led the creation and expansion of public primary education. Because, and that's the first thing that I didn't say, sort of the today all countries have universal or near universal primary education, but this was something that was led first by Western Europe, then followed by US and Canada, and then Latin America. Latin America within the developing world was the first region to accomplish universal primary education. And so the question that I study is, why did the Western world take the lead in this regard? And democratization can't explain it, because in the Western world, democracy came much later than the creation of public primary education systems, decades later, sometimes an entire century later, and also the introduction of the mass franchise did not generally lead to an expansion in access to primary education, in part because by then already 70% of children on average had access to education. So there wasn't really much room to.
Okay, what about industrialization?
Industrialization has a similar thing in that in many countries the timing doesn't add up. There are countries, for instance, Prussia was the leader in creating access to a compulsory primary education system. And it did so in 1763 when it was an entirely agrarian economy. And same as that, Sweden, Norway, Austria, these are all countries that led in terms of expansion of primary education. And they did so when they were still agrarian countries before the onset of industrialization there. And on the other hand, you have countries like England that were leaders in industrialization and lagged completely behind the rest of Europe in expanding access to primary education. And I know we want to come back to that later, but just to put out there that the timing of primary education systems, their creation, doesn't really match the onset of industrialization. In many countries, it preceded the onset of industrialization. And then in countries where it did coincide, the other thing that I look at is, okay, did the onset of industrialization lead to an expansion in the rate of access, or a more rapid acceleration in access? And again, for the Western world, I don't find that. We can come back to something that I think is quite interesting, which is that in the non-West, you do see an acceleration of primary education access after industrialization or around the time of industrialization, but you don't see that pattern in the West.
And you make an interesting comment that the first industrial revolution mostly required unskilled labor. So, like, if people were just doing something rudimentary with machines, you don't need a skilled workforce.
Yes, and that's not something that I came up with. It's
Mm.
just like following on the work of many economic historians who have documented this, and that usually they refer to the first industrial revolution as a de-skilling process, because it did require a large but unskilled workforce. The
Okay,
second
what about
industrial revolution
military?
is different.
Sorry, what about military rivalry?
Yeah, so military rivalry, this is an interesting one because there was a recent article that had documented an expansion of access to primary education as measured by the enrollment rates after interstate wars. And I took that data set and I sort of replicated the results. And I found two things. First, in the non West, you do see a more rapid expansion of primary education after interstate wars. But in the West, you don't really see that. And what you see in the West is that there is an expansion of primary education after interstate wars, but it's just a recovery from the decline in enrollments that happens during the war. It's not a new enrollment. So it's there's a big decline and then a partial recovery after the war. So that's not really an explanation for why the West led the expansion of primary education.
I thought that was a really nice comment in your book, by the way. Like you're saying, well, yeah, sure, it falls during war and then goes back once you have a bit of stability. I thought that was, I found that hilarious. There was me chuckling along. Okay, and what about nation building?
Well, nation building is interesting. The way that I deal with nation building, so I think that the nation building theory, there's many different explanations for what might drive a government to become interested in using education to instill a common national identity, right? And so some of those theories we've already discarded, because one of those theories is that what drives interest in the nation building role of education is interstate wars. And so we've talked about how interstate wars are very limited in our ability to explain education expansion in the West. But there's another aspect to nation building that I address in the book, not through looking at the timing of expansion and timing of creation, but looking at the content of the curriculum. One of the basic tenets of nation building is that education seeks to promote a common language. And think back, if anyone has read like Ernest Gellner, for example, he was very adamant about how states developed education systems to instill a common language that workers could use in factories and so on and so forth. So, this idea of a common language, if that were indeed a goal of the creation of primary educations, we should see that reflected in the official curriculum, right? That we're gonna teach a common language as part of the official curriculum. And so what I did was I looked at the first primary education laws of European and Latin American countries and coded what did the official curriculum require. And what you see is that only half the countries require instruction in a common language, and the other half do not require instruction in a common language. So that is also not a pervasive component of efforts. There are many countries, again, going back to Prussia. Prussia is the leader. It's the country that, like today, Finland, everyone is looking at what's Finland doing in education. Back in the day, it was Prussia. The US was sending people to Prussia. Horace Mann was going to Prussia. Countries throughout Europe, countries throughout Latin America, they were sending officials to Prussia. And Yet, when you look at what Prussia did in 1763 and 1765, etc., they weren't imposing German. They said we'll teach in German in the places that speak German, we'll teach in Polish in the places that teach Polish. We won't impose a common religious identity either. Some places are Protestant, other places are Catholic. We'll respect whatever is in place in those places. And so again, you see there just one example of an important example in this case because it led the way, where initially the goal wasn't nation building. Now, I don't want to say that it never happens. In France, they did incorporate a goal of instilling a common language, starting with the 1833 law. But the point is that this was not the norm.
I wanted to say how much I really appreciated your point on cross cultural learning, like people going from Chile, Argentina to study Prussia, and everyone like look at, and I think that's something that we often omit or downplay in country level studies, how much people were really trying to emulate and get excited about what was going on in Prussia. And that's such an, I think that point ties so nicely with so much of the my evolving theory about prestige bias. We look
Mm.
to the vanguard. And also, and we'll come to another point, how you say that learning cross country learning is not enough. It interacts with crises. So maybe you can tell me about internal conflict and how that shaped people's adoption of those ideas.
Right, because there was a group of sociologists in the past that had talked about the influence of Prussia and creating an education model, but their argument was that you have an education model that then becomes imported and adopted by the rest of the world, sort of automatically as soon as you are exposed to Prussian ideas. And what I show is that that's actually not the case. There's often decades of a lag between learning about what Prussia is doing and actually creating your own primary education system. And what I document is that what often triggers moving from just exposure to this idea that education could be really helpful to indoctrinate people and instill obedience to actually doing something about it is the occurrence of episodes of internal crisis. So, situations in which there's particularly mass violence against the status quo. People don't like existing institutions and they're taking to the streets or taking to the countryside to protest about it. Those are situations that generate a lot of anxiety among political elites because they benefit from the established order and the status quo. And these are also situations when this crisis of internal order occur. These are situations in which elites realize or at least judge that the existing policy tools that they've been using so far to promote social order are not necessarily adequate or sufficient. And so, what happens usually in this crisis of internal order, we can come back to some specific examples, but they'll send the National Guard to repress protesters and then realize that the members of the National Guard are just standing there and not repressing people because they also share the same grievances that people are protesting about. That's something that happened in France, for
Yeah.
example, in the 1830s. And so, through these various experiences of repression failing or concessions not being enough, because once you give a concession, you can't really prevent people who are upset today from asking for even more in the future, right? And so there's these episodes of internal crisis that create a sense that you need to do more, and that what you need to do, in addition to using repression and concessions to deal with things in the short term, you also need to invest in preventing long term social disorder. And the way to do that is by taking seriously those ideas that had been circulating for a while but that weren't being implemented, that you can create a primary education system to teach people to obey, to respect the state, to respect the law, and so on and so forth. So these episodes are really important in forging a consensus among elites around the idea of creating a state regulated primary education system to indoctrinate people into respecting the state without question.
Let me say 2 points that I really, really appreciate about what you're doing there, because in many ways there are contemporary parallels, right? You're saying information isn't enough, whether it's about some RCT, right? It's not enough to know what Prussia's doing. It's not enough to have the RCT. It's about the incentives. What are the elites actually trying to achieve? And by elites, you mean both the national level and also the local level, like the nobility. What do they want? And do they realize that their existing strategies for their goals are ineffective? Okay, so we'll get to the country case studies in a minute. I just wanted to push you on two alternative hypotheses. So what about the Protestant Reformation? How does that play into this? Because that's giving people the incentive, the demand to become literate, to study the Bible, and as you say in the book, that gives you an existing stock of more literate people. I wonder, and those ideas might spill over into Catholic countries nearby. I wonder how heavily you weight the Protestant Reformation.
So just looking at again patterns, particularly within Europe, because you don't have variation of Catholic Protestant countries in Latin America, right? But within Europe, you do have countries that are have a legacy of Protestantism and some that are more Catholic. And you're right that in places where Protestantism was salient and the Protestant Reformation was important, and obviously Prussia is key here. They start off the 19th century with a much higher stock of schools and of literacy, and the government's efforts to create a primary education system often builds on those pre-existing efforts, those the infrastructure left behind in terms of the number of schools that had been created, the teachers that had also been trained, and so on. Whereas in Catholic countries, you have less of that infrastructure. But what the Protestant legacy does not predict is it's not that countries with a legacy of Protestantism adopt primary education laws sooner, or that Catholic ones adopted later. So it doesn't really, sort of the religious legacy doesn't really match or predict the timing of when the government becomes interested.
But it be a necessary condition to have that educational infrastructure. So here's a point. So your book is extremely expansive, but it focuses on Western governments. So as a result of the Protestant Reformation and spillover of education in Catholic countries, you have a vast number of people who at local levels, where there are all these, different local level schools, whether those are dame schools in England or some other voluntary initiative. You've got lots of people who could potentially become secular school teachers. So when you've got a crisis and you need to indoctrinate everyone for obedience, you've got this ready army of secular teachers. And I wonder, suppose you are a government in the Middle East and you're struck by an internal conflict, you don't have that same infrastructure of secular teachers, but you've got an infrastructure of something slightly different, mosques and madrasas, and they could play the same role. So I wonder if the Protestant Reformation gives you a slightly different choice on the kind of architecture that you want to use for instilling obedience.
It's quite interesting what you're saying, because I think there's an underlying assumption in the comment that the priority was to have skilled teachers, teachers who were literate, and that to the extent that Protestantism had created a lot of that mass, then it enabled you to recruit more skilled teachers easily. Um, but when you look at the efforts to recruit teachers, the emphasis isn't on trying to find people who are literate. The emphasis is on trying to find people who have the right moral character
Really?
and who are gonna be sort of role models in the class. Right. This goes back to the whole point, right? That the the main goal of education is about instilling the right moral character, teaching people to be quiet, to be obedient, to follow rules. And so the priority in terms of training and recruiting teachers was on screening people for that moral character. And yes, sometimes it turned out that nuns, priests, etc., also had the right moral character, and they were helpful for that. but I think you'll be particularly interested in this, Alice, given your interest in gender. In Latin America, you didn't have this prior infrastructure. The
Mhm.
Catholic Church and the Spanish, Portuguese, etc., colonizers did essentially very little or to nothing in terms of education provision. Everything happens post independence, and there's a very rapid expansion of primary education without that prior stock beforehand. And how do they do it? They look and recruit women. Why? Because they see women as first having no outside job options. Women as teachers, I mean, they very purposely target women to be able to recruit a very large number of teachers to expand very rapidly access to education. And they think of women as being the right way to go about things, first because they don't have any outside options, so in the job market, and so they say you're gonna be able to hire a lot of them at a really low uh, cost salary. And the second thing they say is because women are really docile, and what you need are docile people who are gonna sort of internalize the same values that the state wants to diffuse. And that's going to be a really helpful way to do it, is through women who have this sort of,
Nice.
yeah.
And the other point that you make about intellectual shifts I thought was so interesting. So we usually associate the Enlightenment with this free thinking, liberal thinking, and secularism. And you make this really interesting point that during the Enlightenment, people changed their conception about how human nature was malleable. Can you tell us more about that?
um Tell me more about the last
Like
thing you said about.
you were saying that during the Enlightenment, people came to think that people could be taught to behave in a certain kind of way, and
Oh,
if you
yeah.
instill fear of punishment, then that could encourage people to act in a certain way, or you could encourage people to have you could shape people's minds and shape
Absolutely.
their behavior.
Yeah, yeah. And actually this goes back to Plato, like well before the Enlightenment. But I do think that, and I discuss this in some length. It's not the focus of the book, but going through what Kant talked about with respect to education, or what Rousseau said on education, Hobbes in Leviathan, right? And they all consistently talk about how people are not born um, inadequate or immoral, but the environment by which they are surrounded can induce them toward vice. And so, what you need to do to prevent vices from emerging is to surround people with the right environment. And so, this sort of very basic idea that floats around during the Enlightenment also contributes to ideas about why the state needs to become involved in the education of children, because there's also at the same time this interest in, okay, if it's no longer divine right of kings that's going to sustain the political authority, we need another way, as part of social contract theory, we need another way to legitimize existing laws and have people respect them. And so there's folks that today we associate with like very liberal, like Rousseau, who are very adamant about how there are laws for adults, but there should also be laws for children, and those laws for children should particularly emphasize the importance of obedience. And that's something that the state has an interest of its own in instilling, because if it teaches children to obey from a young age, they'll continue to obey as they grow up and as they become citizens. So the whole point was that if you want to form citizens for tomorrow, you need to start very early on. And when you start very early on, you need to instill the importance of respecting rules, being obedient, being dutiful, being disciplined, and all of that, because that type of environment will in the long term prevent vices and sort of mass contestation of the state's authority and so on.
Okay, I love your book so much because you're really combining all the core ingredients of political economy, incentives, ideas, and institutions. Now, let me pick up on one thing you just said that I think is really important. People had lost faith in The Divine Right of Kings. So, for example, Guillaume Blanc has this nice paper about secularization in France over the 18th century. Neil Cummins has a forthcoming work where he analyzes, I think it's 6 centuries of English wills, and he finds that, like, over the 18th century, people are increasingly secular. You know, they're not referring to God, Jesus, or making bequests to the church. And I think that's a really important point, that in many Western countries, you are seeing secularism, and you're also seeing the rise of literacy and print culture, right? So people buy newspapers. And so if people become more secular, and if they become exposed to a wide range of ideas, all kinds of radical ideas, then you may, so it's like a spit, it's like a, maybe you could think of it as a, like a backlash to a, you know, a little bit of literacy is a dangerous thing, because then people start questioning authority. They're not controlled by the usual institutions of, say, being entirely dependent on nobles. They're not entirely confined to the constraints of what the church tells them. So they hear these alternative ideas, they get a bit uppity, and then boom, you need to put them back in their place.
Yes, and this is a really interesting sort of this idea that education can in fact be destabilizing if it gives people access to literacy skills that then enables them to read radical pamphlets and exposure to radical ideas. This is one way of thinking about education as potentially being destabilizing, and this was the notion of education that was predominant in England during the first half of the 19th century. And so one of the things that I argue in the book is that that is something that distinguishes England from continental Europe. In continental Europe, there were very few people who argued that mass education was going to be destabilizing. Because if you think to, for instance, what Prussia was doing, the they had a sense that they were going to control all of the texts that kids were exposed to. They were just going to read the things that they were supposed to read to instill obedience. And they didn't plan on there being access to radical books elsewhere. Um, so they may have been wrong. I'm not saying that they weren't wrong, but they didn't think of it. They, in some ways, you can think of them as being very arrogant and having a sense that they were going to control everything and prevent this. But this was the notion that was predominant in continental Europe, that the state was going to control the curriculum. It was going to control who the teachers that kids were exposed to were, etc., etc. So there was not really much of a risk. Whereas in England, you did have a strong sense that it was a risk. And so I think that that's part of why England falls behind in expanding primary education, because they do see it for a really long time as a threat to the state's authority.
Okay, so let's talk more about Prussia. I want to understand this. So this is the educational leader. So talk me through. So in the book, you highlight how a growing number of people, like for example, when landless, they started working on these nobles' farms, but and the nobles' farms, and as the nobles became increasingly mobile, you didn't have that sense of long-term loyalty, and so we saw the eruption of peasant revolts and peasant rebellions, and so both at the local level and the national level, the elites got scared that their existing systems just weren't controlling the peasants.
Right. And it was really the biggest concern was at the national level, because the national level had previously relied on seigneurial authority in the countryside to maintain order. And as you say, there was a lot of rotation in who owned land. And so suddenly the peasants were working in lands that were owned by people that they didn't have any ties with. And there was a big spike in grain prices that led these new landlords and other older landlords to demand peasants to work even more days than they were previously obliged to. And so this kind of increase in the labor obligations of peasants, compounded by, well, we don't feel any sense of allegiance or that we owe you anything because we don't know you that much, that was kind of what precipitated these peasant revolts. And what happened at the time was that the the king's advisors told the king, look, one of the things that we need to do is agrarian reform to appease the peasants and to address their grievances. And the king did do that, right? He passed royal decrees to reduce by sort of royal decree the number of days that the peasants were obligated to work in the land. But the king's advisors were very aware of the fact that agrarian reform on its own was probably not going to be sufficient, because nothing prevented the peasants from in the future demanding even less obligations. And so there was a sense of, how do we prevent some of these peasant revolts from happening again in the future? And what they realized was that this breakdown in seigneurial authority signaled a crisis in political authority, that what you needed to create was, if allegiance to the landlord was no longer present, you needed to create some sort of allegiance to a political authority. And this in Prussia was a period where the state was being built and centralized, and sort of concentrating a lot of power. And Frederick the Great, who was king at the time, he was really interested in creating loyalty to the king. And so he partnered in some ways with pietist reformers, who told the king, look, we can use schools. So back to sort of the idea that religion can provide supportive infrastructure, right? This was definitely the case in Prussia. But what the pietist Protestant reformers told the king was, we can use this infrastructure not just to instill obedience to God, but also instill obedience to the king. And so the king was really much on board with that idea, and he gave funding for the Berlin Normal School, which was founded by pietists to be sort of the central place that trained and recruited teachers. He passed the 1763 General Rural Schools Regulations, which are the piece of legislation of education in Prussian history. It creates a compulsory schooling system that kids have to go through until they reach confirmation. And then in that same law, it's essentially the first time that a government regulates every single aspect of schooling, from the timetable or schedule to how many days of the year you have to go, and how discipline needs to be enforced by the teacher, who the teachers can be, etc., 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 what the curriculum needs to teach, and so on. So but it was all precipitated by these peasant rebels, and the sense that you couldn't deal with them with repression. Concessions were not enough either, and there were these ideas that were floating around about how you could use mass education to prevent future peasant rebels from recurring.
I have one question. So, do you have any idea what Prussian education was like before those revolts and rebellions? Like, was it ever more liberal, or did they always have a culture of instilling obedience in schools?
Um, I don't know ever. I do know that the pietist reformers, one of the things that they were concerned about was that they um, and this preceding the peasant revolts, like from earlier, the revolts happened in the 1740s and 1750s, right? But earlier in the 18th century, there was already a concern about people's moral character, and that people had become too materialistic, and that you needed to kind of reconnect people with sort of a sense of duty that wasn't just driven by wanting to accumulate material riches and so on. And so there were, through pietist pedagogies, efforts to reform the curriculum, but they were geared toward instilling a sense of duty toward God in some ways. I think the big innovation wasn't that it became less liberal. The innovation that happens in 1763, it's not that it becomes less liberal, it's that to the agenda of instilling obedience to God, you add the agenda of instilling obedience to the king, which is a
And one thing you say is how the large component of the curriculum that was dedicated to this. Like, was it a third of classes were all like morality and obedience or something?
I don't remember the numbers right now,
It was
but
something large. It was
it was
something large. In the great book, Raised to Obey, it gives a large figure that I found surprising.
yeah. Well, it was really the moral education was
Mm.
pervasive, because what you had in Prussia was instruction like a dedicated class to moral education, and then you had classes in reading and classes in writing. Those were the compulsory subjects. Arithmetic wasn't a required class. And what you had was that they were usually taught in that order. So first you learned moral and religious education, because they were kind of, they came together in the case of Prussia. And then you learned reading, and then you learned writing. So there were a lot of kids who left school before they started to learn how to write. Um, and
Wait. So
what
when you say in sections, you mean like the first few years, or you mean the first
there
part of the
was
day?
no, that in your education you usually learned to read before you learned to write.
Right.
not
Okay.
not within the day, but in the structure. It wasn't like there was no writing, but the focus earlier on was on moral education and reading, and reading in that context where you don't know how to write. A lot of it was just very sort of memorizing. The teacher would read aloud and the kids would memorize what the catechism
Yes.
said.
Yes.
So
Okay. I want to jump to 1830s France. Tell me
okay,
about 1830s France.
1830s France is a really interesting moment in French history. They've overthrown the Bourbon dynasty through the July 1830 revolution, and a new government comes to power. It's the July monarchy. They come to power in part with support from the lower classes who fight in the July revolution. But the trouble that the July monarchy then faces is that the same people who had supported them to overthrow the previous monarchy are continuing to riot, and the riots get particularly acute in the countryside in rural France, where, again, similar to the case in Prussia, the crisis is driven originally by economic issues. There was a very bad harvest. The price of food became exorbitant, and people blamed the government for not doing enough. And in the rural areas, they were destroying granaries, destroying tax collection offices, just because of how upset they were with the government. And what the government does initially is send the National Guard to try to control that situation. One of the people who was the Minister of the Interior at that time under the July monarchy was Francois Guizot. And in his memoirs, he recalls how that was a futile and even counter sort of backfired, because oftentimes the members of the National Guard would join the protesters they were supposed to repress. And so the idea then becomes much more supported that what you need to do is you need to prevent future similar episodes by creating a national primary education system, which it's I don't think it's coincidental that Guizot is the one who is put in charge with drafting France's first primary education law of 1833. And he is very clear about the goal of that law. He says, we're not here trying to address people's economic grievances. We're not trying to improve their material condition. This isn't about lifting people out of poverty. This is about improving their moral character. And that's the primary goal. And they do add to that teaching everyone to speak French. That is also part of the agenda, as we were talking earlier. But if you look at the curriculum, the main emphasis is teaching people a set of moral principles that are going to prevent people from becoming engaged in violence, and particularly violence against the state.
Wow. Okay. Now I want to come to one of the really awesome comparison you do between Chile and Argentina. And I think this is really great because you show how very different governments can use education to instill their own obedience to their own ideology. So just briefly, in the interest of time, can you just take me through that little comparison and then we'll move on to other case studies?
Yeah, so Chile has a very basic curriculum: moral education, reading, writing, arithmetic. Argentina also in its curriculum has a lot of science, and a more complex curriculum, has chemistry, physics, geometry, not just arithmetic and algebra. And so you might think, when you look at these two curricula, well, Argentina is really trying to promote economic development. It's trying to give people skills that are going to improve their economic productivity. And when you read the debates that happen in parliament, again, this is not what politicians have in mind. What happens in Argentina is that the political elites that have more power at that time are secular liberal elites, not liberal in the sense of wanting to democratize, liberal in the sense that they are anti-church. And so from their standpoint, their goal through primary education is to improve the moral character of people. That is shared with the Chilean case as well. The main goal, again, is improve the moral character of the masses. But in the Argentine context, the liberals believe that the basis of morality is the capacity to access abstract principles. That if everyone can think abstractly, they are going to realize that cheating is bad, killing is bad, vandalizing is bad, harming other people is bad, rebelling against the state is bad, and so on and so forth. And so, what the liberals propose is including in the curriculum more subjects that are going to enable people to think logically and think abstractly so that they can access these universal moral principles. Whereas in Chile, what you have is that the coalition that predominates is not liberals but conservatives who believe that the basis of morality is not that capacity to reason and think abstractly, but the basis of morality is Christian doctrine, and so they don't really invest in these other subjects. Now, of course, the Argentina case may have and probably did backfire in terms of creating a middle class that has better skills with better access to better jobs, and that middle class eventually forms its own party and kind of organizes revolutions, overthrows the oligarchic regime. But that wasn't what they had in mind.
Okay, I love that. And you talk, and the American case is very consistent with all that. You talk about the Rebellion and the Shays Rebellion. Now, I want to move on to England. So,
Okay.
England, as you say, was this latecomer to rolling out mass state education. And it seems that in this case, it's the exception that proves the rule. So, can you talk to me about why England was especially late to roll out this mass education?
Right. Yeah, you would expect England, right? Like industrialization, democratization, all of these things happen well before other they happen in other countries. And if these are good explanations, you would expect England to be a precursor in expanding access to primary education. And yet, by 1850, for countries for which we have data on access to primary education, England is the only country that has single digit primary school enrollment rates in Europe. And I think the enrollment is around 9% in England in 1850. In Spain, which has the second lowest enrollment at the time, it's around 25% of enrollment. So
But I think
really,
one issue in England, right, is that they had lots, it was a very diverse ecosystem. So there are all sorts of different things going on, like whether it's Sunday schools, dame schools, voluntary schools. It's just, it doesn't have that state controlled
exactly,
apparatus.
exactly. And it doesn't have that until 1870. So like an entire century after Prussia does the creation of a centralized system. And so there is a question of like, why did England lag behind until 1870, which is when the Forster Elementary Education Act is passed? You don't have state control over primary education. It's delegated in big ways to the Anglican Church and so on, right? And so what I argue in the book is that the what leads England in large part to lag behind is precisely the lack of agreement among elites that education is good for preventing political instability. There were concerns with political instability throughout the 19th century around the radicalization of working class members who were joining unions, etc. But the perception in England during the first half of the 19th century among elites was that education was good for individual autonomy, for empowering people. And so they were like, why on earth would we want to empower the working class? Again, this is a very different way of thinking about education than what it's the way in which people thought about mass education in continental Europe. And I think that that's part of the reason why England lags behind. Now, what do you also, I don't know if you want me to talk about why England catches up, like why did they ever in 1870 adopt the Forster Education Act? And here you do see a change in ideas around the mid 19th century, where when people start writing more about, and in part because they're looking at continental Europe and saying, well, actually, maybe we could use education to create more political instability and social order. You see it more in novels, sort of in popular culture, people writing more about the state's own reasons for using education. um, and what you have then, again, ideas are not enough. What you have then is in the 1860s, you have a set of big demonstrations in London, in Manchester, in Leeds, where the response to that, the immediate response to that is the Second Reform Act, right? People are protesting against the status quo and in part demanding voting rights. And so they say, okay, let's give them voting rights to appease them. But the other thing that then becomes urgent among elites at the time in response to the mass protests is the issue of, now we really do need to take education seriously and have the state become involved in it, because even we've just had these protests that signal that people don't know how to behave, and we've granted them political rights. So this is like combo for the worst thing that could happen is you've given political rights to people who are savages. And so there's kind of this political, and I'm not saying I agree with that, just
Yeah.
the what people were talking about back then. And then you do get finally, just a few years after these mass demonstrations, the Forster Elementary Education Act, to address what people thought was this urgent problem of dealing with the masses and their inadequate
Okay,
behavior.
this is awesome. Now I have a question. Okay, so I was thinking, so in your methodology, you're so thorough because you look at the content of the curriculum, the teacher training, etc. But I have another potential indicator of liberalism, which
Mhm.
I want you to tell me whether you think this is a good indicator or not, whether corporal punishment is allowed.
Oh,
Because I think that allowing corporal punishment is the idea of teachers having physical authority over the students to instill obedience. And then what I found, do you know the first country? So would you accept that's a good indicator of liberalism versus obedience?
I wouldn't.
Okay, why not? Tell me why not.
Yeah, actually, in a lot of these countries, and starting with the pietists, they argued that corporal punishment wasn't the best way to promote obedience. There was a lot of concern that schools were supposed to model the behavior that you wanted kids to then internalize and carry out through their
Right, you
lives.
want people to really believe it, not do it out of fear.
So if you, they wanted to, as much as possible, prevent teachers from being violent because they didn't want kids to learn from that example. So the approach that they thought was, and Enlightenment philosophers also, on this kind of Enlightenment philosophers and pietist pedagogies, uh, kind of converged that the preferable approach was to use soft kinds of punishments and rewards. So, for example, and soft, I mean, it's still like, if it's not corporal punishment, it can still be
Yeah,
like a
yeah.
really horrible experience. But one of the things, for instance, in countries where moral education was religious, what they emphasized was that if you were to violate laws and rules, etc., you were going to be punished by God and you were going to go to hell. So this was
Yeah,
in
that's more
in
than
text,
corporal punishment.
right?
By the way, do
So
you know the first country that banned corporal punishment?
I don't know what that is. Do you?
Poland in
Poland?
1783.
Interesting.
Yeah, and then like the Netherlands, 1920, there was a reform pedagogy movement. England only banned it in 1999, which I thought was
Wow.
really late.
Wow.
Yeah, I was looking into this morning. Sweden, they banned it in 1855.
Okay.
Anyway, okay, so now I want to move to another section. So we have all these. Sorry.
Just one thing is that it
Yeah.
wasn't just about punishments, it was also about rewards, right? So there were also countries that were also not using God as the basis for going to hell, going to heaven, because they had a secular form of moral education. But even in those countries, what they emphasized was like, well, if you misbehave, your friends and your peers are going to think less of you. And so they put kids in a corner in front of the class. They used humiliation. Or they would praise kids, right? Like what we do even in schools today is like stickers and
Yeah,
post
yeah.
like, pictures of kids. So it was more about those types of inducements to get kids to comply and to want to be obedient than the corporal punishment mechanism.
Okay, now I have a new set. So this is great. Now I have a new set of questions. So we have this history of instilling obedience, but some countries have moved to a more liberal system, while others have not. So, for example, I've done interviews in lots of different parts of the world. I talk to kids in Uzbekistan, and they say how strict every single thing is. Like even the level of their haircut, what they're supposed to do, everything is tightly monitored. I was just in Rome last week, and I was chatting to people, and they were saying how authoritarian their school were. Like they were saying it was just rote learning. I spent 3 months, I didn't tell you this, I spent 3 months sitting in Zambian schools. I just sat in a classroom for 3 months in three different schools. I would just sit in classrooms, and so often it's just writing on the board, etc. Whereas my own education in England was so different. I was just at this school where I was a dutiful student, where I did the homework, etc., and I attended every class. But even at age 14 or 15, I would say to the teachers, I'm not sure you should really manage the class like this. I don't think you should plan it like this. Why are we reading this chapter rather than that chapter? Like, I would directly challenge their course management, and I was never be in trouble. Like, that would be totally accepted for some 14-year-old girl to say, well, I don't think we should read this book when this book seems superior for this aspect. Like, I would present an argument as to, like, totally challenging the teacher's authority, and I was never once punished for that. So that seems like a really liberal education, right? So I could just, little Alice Evans could just say all this kind of stuff and she doesn't know anything, right? And gets away with it. So my question to you is, why have some countries transitioned to a liberal education and others have not?
And I want to kind of clarify that this isn't something that I address in the book. We can talk about this, but to me that's an important.
Okay, maybe I should rephrase that to like focus on skills.
No, no,
Like you
that's
talk.
okay. It's totally fine. I think that the next generation of research needs to be precisely okay, if these systems were created to promote primarily obedience across the board, why have some countries given up a little bit on the indoctrination goal and moved toward promoting more skills, social mobility, etc.? I think that's a really important, crucial question that we need to figure out, and I have some ideas on what that might be. But the first thing I want to note is that I I think that the question of whether countries have moved to be more liberal and to what extent and how many countries, that needs to be addressed first, because your experience with England's education system, I don't know, and I'm not saying it's not, I don't know if it's representative of
No,
what kids in
yeah, no, no,
England
I accept
experience.
that point.
And I'll give you examples from the United States, right? Like I know a lot of people who send their kids to public schools or private schools in the United States that are super liberal. They're talking about kids' emotions and the importance of honoring your emotions. And there's a lot of room for kids to debate and so on and so forth. But what's interesting is that those tend to be the schools that are available to affluent individuals.
Right,
Whereas when you
yes.
go to schools that serve low income families and children, those emphasize discipline heavily. And that model of authoritarian education, or focus on discipline obedience, the goal was primarily to control the behavior of people who might be upset with the status quo, not affluent people who are doing fine with the status quo. And so I do wonder, and I think there are
Yeah, to
some.
push back, do you know Darana Jimolu and others paper on this?
Which paper?
So Darana Jimolu and others, they have a paper arguing, so they're looking, comparing across countries and also within countries, and they argue that working class parents encourage their children for highly value obedience in their children, as shown in World
Yeah,
Value
yeah.
Survey data, because they're schooling their children for low wage labor markets where people just want them to be cogs in a factory machine. Whereas people like me, born to affluent parents, they think, wow, Alice can have all these opportunities in a creative economy, and its innovation and defiance is rewarded, right? Me on that
Right,
podcast, right?
right.
So,
Absolutely. Yeah, and I've read Daron's work where he talks about obedience is part of also what improves your productivity in some contexts. I mean, there's a certain point where maybe that's true, but then there's also a question of to what extent do these parents think about this, because that's also the education that they received, and they think that that's what's normal, and the jobs that they have access to are the ones that require obedience. But what if we were to educate those kids in a way that frees them, empowers them? I think that the question of how parents might respond to that, if they were to also learn that that would give them access to a different set of jobs, I think that's still an open
So that's a
question.
really good point. You're saying that the Ajamolu paper, Ajamolu et al. Paper is focusing on demand, but it could just actually be supply. And intergenerationally, the working class has been
Right.
socialized or
Exactly.
raised to obey. That's a very nice
Exactly.
point. That's a very nice point. Okay, now I want to come to another question. Do you personally, what is your view on this? Do you personally think that each parent should have autonomy to decide how to educate their children?
I do.
Really?
I do.
Like even to
Uh,
the point of faith schools, homeschools.
oh, that doesn't mean that I also don't think that the government should be involved in educating children. I think both things are true, right? There's a sphere of what the government does in the classroom, and then there's a sphere of what parents do in with
But what do
children.
you think about faith schools? So for example, I think this is a very live issue in Europe. So as our fertility falls, we desperately need migrants to maintain a working age population and economic growth. And so we see a rising mix of cultures, and cultural diversity can be incredibly valuable if Joe Henrika and others argue that you enable a platform where people can share from each other, where people can learn from each other, where people can have some sense of social cohesion and then build on all their interconnections and diversity. And one thing I'm concerned about is that if you don't have everyone buying into the same system, such as through government schools, then you may cause ghettoization and fragmentation. And so I personally wonder if there are actually some merits to a state controlled curriculum rather than say homeschooling and faith schooling.
Right,
So
right.
maybe that's slightly, I
Yeah,
said
yeah,
that
yeah.
actually the thing that you think is terrible in this book, this obedience system,
Yeah,
actually that's creating that, arguably, like if we look at the French example, that's creating French social cohesion, that everyone bought, it was super repressive, punishing kids for speaking, in Breton or whatever, but it also built a strong French identity, and that shared national identity paves the way for public goods, commitment to, yeah, the
yeah.
social cohesion.
So let me clarify, because you asked about my personal
Yeah,
thoughts and
yeah.
beliefs on this. I think education, leave aside the question of who provides it and who regulates it. I think education should be for children. It should be to give children the tools and knowledge to live autonomous lives and to choose what path they want to pursue. And one of the things that entails, it's crucial for personal autonomy, is not just basic skills but critical thinking skills. You can't choose what life you want to pursue if you can't assess the range of different options that are available and think through the pros and cons and so on. And so I think that to me is what the very first goal that education should pursue, and it's one about a path for personal autonomy, not a path to serve the interests of the state. There's a question then that I think it's an open empirical question. Some people, I think, worry that if you have a curriculum that emphasizes critical thinking for the sake of cultivating personal autonomy, that could be destabilizing, because then people are going to question everything. I don't know that that's actually the case. I know a lot of people who have very strong critical thinking who don't go around violating all the laws. So there's also that's an open
No,
question.
I,
But I
I accept that. But I think, for example, it's not just about violating laws, but about having a sense of shared identity and a shared concern for the public good and a shared interpersonal trust, right? So trust is super, super important, and it's associated with many public goods. And you may have, if people are coming from diverse places, they may have a strong allegiance, loyalty to that particular community. And if you allow everyone to be totally autonomous, they may just stick with their own, right? If you say, for example, me coming from a small town in Kent, which is like a little countryside place in England, if I've never been to Scotland, if I've never interacted with people from Scotland, I may be a little bit skeptical, a little bit worried about what they're up to. Maybe I've just seen films about Highlanders, William Wallace, and I think that, so I think there is that if people have a natural preference to stick with their own, to do their own thing, to trust their own, then those preferences can encourage, or those preferences may discourage assimilation and integration. And if you want to build a community where everyone trusts each other, gets on well with each other, reciprocates, then I see a role for the state and a limit of a very liberal personal autonomy type view. See, now
So
the liberal English person is
yeah.
not so liberal.
The first thing that I want to just clarify is that, like, among philosophers who write about personal autonomy in education, there's the notion is not that you're going to be stuck in your village. It's on the contrary. It's like that you part of the autonomy agenda is to expose you to a lot of different viewpoints, a lot of different identities, a lot of different ways of living, precisely so you can choose how you want to live your life. And so that, I don't think, is sort of a clash between sort of being exposed to multicultural perspective, etc. But the one thing I want to say is that we don't need to agree on this aspect. But what I do think is important is that if the state is gonna impose a certain set of values, those values should be chosen through a democratic process. That's not the way it's been throughout history. It's a set of elites who said, this is what we need in order to maintain social order and our privilege also. And I think today we are in a world where, in England and in many other countries, there are liberal democracies, and the process for making education policy decisions should catch up with that political development and should engage a wide sector of society so as to uh, come up with a values, a set of regulations that people can agree on. That it's not just the state imposing this, but that people buy into it. And I think that that's kind of one of the things that education systems haven't had much of.
Okay, let me push back in two ways. So first of all, I think, if you give people autonomy, then ultra religious groups may just choose to homeschool their children. So that would be, and doesn't necessarily involve, mixing with others. So for example, last year I was in small town Alabama, where a woman who had 6 kids was removing her kids from Alabama's public schools because she thought Alabama's public schools were too liberal, right? So if you have very conservative ideas, you don't want to mix. And the other thing is that, when we talk about popular I think that schools are a hugely important form of cultural influence, hugely important.
Mhm.
And it's not necessary, and indoctrination can happen just because teachers, as you were saying earlier, have a certain kind of ideology. So for example, in the US and across Europe, if it's the case that the vast majority of your teachers are women with very progressive ideology, then they may be transferring that to their children. So and then you get kids who are very, very progressive. So I think so even if you're involving a large sector of society, such as teachers, then they can share their ideas. Okay, one more question.
Can I
Yeah,
clarify
yeah.
one
Feel
thing
free.
on the ultra religious point, right? That if you stuck with my agenda of education should be about cultivating critical thinking and personal authority, then from my standpoint, I do think there is a role for the state to regulate all kinds of education to ensure that that's the case. And so an ultra religious school that is preventing kids from criticizing religious doctrine, etc., that would clash with regulation. So that's
Whoa, 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 whoa! Now we're in tricky
yeah.
philosophical territory. So you are saying that you might not allow a faith school that it only taught its one faith as the truth, because you
Not
would.
if it doesn't, not if it doesn't allow kids to question it.
So if there was a school that only taught its faith as the true faith, you think the state should intervene to repress their autonomy?
That's a very yeah.
Aha!
Yeah,
But isn't
I
that that your elitist preference?
Probably. Yeah, probably. Although I didn't come from an elite background,
Yeah,
so
wow, now
critical,
though,
critical,
now though.
critical thinking did help get to where I
Okay,
am.
okay. Now here's another question. Here's another question. I'll stop trolling you.
Yeah.
How do you think? How do you think? And I should add, these are super super tricky questions, and I'm just messing. How do you think focusing on the West, that is the US, Latin America, and Europe, might limit or shape this theory? And how do you think it would change if we incorporated a bunch of other case studies?
Um, I do think so. First, as you know, in the book, I do look to some extent, small extent, particularly in chapter 2, I do look at non-Western countries in the cross-national analysis. And one of the things that I find there, as I said before, is that there is, for example, more evidence that industrialization led to an expansion of primary education in non-Western countries, right? And so I think that that expanding the regional scope would then lead us to consider a wider range of reasons why countries around the world have had their governments take over education provision. In the former Soviet Union, for example, it wasn't just about indoctrination. There was a very strong interest in supporting the rapid pace of industrialization with people who were highly skilled. And the US became heavily concerned about that because they felt that the US was lagging behind the Soviet Union in its ability to equip people with skills, right? And so I do think that the explanations are going to be different in other parts of the world potentially, but there is also a value of thinking about the Western world, which is that the theory I'm articulating is a theory about education being conceived primarily as a tool to indoctrinate people to respect the state's authority without question. And that argument, I think if I were to make that argument for non Western countries, people would be like, oh, sure, everyone knows China is indoctrinating, everyone knows Russia is indoctrinating, and Singapore, etc., right? And so I think the point of the book is like, yes, they are. And that model of using education to indoctrinate was actually born in the West. And that's where I think the the contribution comes in. It's that
Okay.
it's not the authoritarian regimes of non-Western countries that are the only ones doing this. They took their models from a system of state-regulated education that emerged in Western societies.
Okay, let me just hold you one there. So number one,
And
let me just
maybe
say,
I know we have to end in 5 minutes. So
okay, let me just say one thing in 60 seconds because I know you
yeah,
have to rush off because you're a busy lady. So I totally love your book, but I would say that China has been doing this long before the West. So a previous podcast guest, Yashen Huang, he's got this wonderful book, The Rise and Fall of the East. And he points out that China has started introducing these meritocratic civil service exams in the 7th century, which became based on Confucianism. And basically, any man in China could ascend to become a high ranking official if you pass these very meritocratic civil service exams, which became based on Confucianism. And what does Confucianism teach? It's like obedience to the ruler, that sons obey their parents, wives obey their husbands, and everyone obeys their ruler. And there's this very nice empirical paper that came out in the Journal of Development Economics a few years ago. And they show, going back to your German parallel, that where there were food price hikes, where there was famine, if there was a lot of Confucianism, which is proxied by like temples and widow chastity, you saw fewer riots. So the idea is that by incentivizing everyone to study Confucianism, you get obedience to the ruler. And so I think China might have been doing it ever since the 7th century. And of course, that spread throughout East Asia. So I think
yeah,
there are lots of global parallels.
right, absolutely. And the reality is, when I've presented the book in many different places, and it's quite interesting and nice to see people who do have expertise in China or have expertise in the Middle East tell me this actually happened also in China, and also the aspect that I highlight about how internal rebellion and there's a sense among some people I've talked to in China that also early 20th century rebellion was one of the things that prompted greater interest on the part of the government on primary education. So anyway, I hope other people study this.
Okay, so
Uh,
wait, what? This is my final question. So, if it's true that incentives matter and elites may have a prior concern for indoctrinating obedience, how
Mhm.
does that help us with like the World Bank's
Right.
education strategy, right?
Yeah.
How do we shift those incentives or how do we actually improve skill? Like, how does your theory help us
Yeah.
improve skills?
The key thing first takeaway is you need to understand politicians' motivations and not assume that they want to do what's right for children, right? And those could be we want to indoctrinate, or it could be something else, right? In the contemporary context, it might be we want to distribute a lot of teaching jobs for patronage. So, but the bottom line is you can't just assume that they want what's good for children. They have a political career, and you need to figure out what they are motivated by. And then the second thing that I think is interesting to take away is that sometimes politicians will do things that we think are good for children, but they won't do it because they're good for children. They do it because it advances their own political agenda. So I'll finish by just going back to the Chile Argentina difference, right? Where in the case of Argentina, the curriculum had a lot of science, and a lot of people would think, oh, that's great because then you get STEM and kids have skills that promotes industrialization, better jobs, social mobility, etc., right? Well, the point for people to realize is that governments can adopt good policies for reasons that have nothing to do with what we want them to adopt them for. In the case of Argentina, they did it because they wanted to get rid of the church and weaken the church, right? And the bottom line there is if today you can understand also politicians' motivations, then you can understand similar windows of opportunity where someone's political incentives align with the reform that you want to adopt because it's a good reform. But the way you go about convincing them is not by telling them how good this is going to be for children. You go about convincing them by telling them how good this is going to be for their political career and their agenda that they want to advance. So that's the key piece that I think is missing so far in the conversation around how to improve the learning crisis that I hope people will start taking more seriously.
Professor Paglayan, honestly, I absolutely love talking to you and I loved your book, Raised to Obey. I strongly, strongly recommend everyone buys it or steals it and uses it to advance their political career.
Thank you, Alice. I appreciate the time. Absolutely fascinating to talk to you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, so listen, stay online and we
Oh,
just upload your